Hey guys, we should be live. Yep. AT, can you say something so I can check your audio?
Something, something.
Awesome stuff. Hey guys, thank you. We are live. Sorry about that. I needed to reboot my machine because of a system update. Yeah, I discovered at the last second. So welcome, guys. Hey, we've got a busy chat. Good to see you all. Today, AT is going to be leading the charge, and yeah. So AT, let's without further ado, tell us what we're going to be doing today.
All right, so let me get my screen share set up. So we're gonna be talking about double standards. I was asking the chat what double standards we think. So Coffee Bean's guess is Trinity and Tawhid. Nope, good guess. Wouldn't be a bad topic to covered. We are going to talk about the double standards of what we accept as authentic sources regarding the life and teachings of Jesus and regarding the life and teachings of Muhammad. So, yep, it's going to be fun. So, double standards. I actually got this quote from you, Lloyd. Double standards are the only standards that Muslims Muslims use. So, a quote I would like to start today out with, and I think this is
Are we
something that's going
sharing?
to be
Yep.
yeah, I think I hit
Yeah, we're
share.
sharing. Yep, we're sharing.
Oh,
Yep.
there we go. Well, I got to go back so they can see it. Here we go. So, uh, double standards, the only standards Muslims use. All right. So, our quote for today that we're going to think about is the palest ink is always better than the sharpest memory. Okay. Because we
It's a
understand
really good
that,
quote.
say what?
That's a really good quote.
It is. It is. So we're going to talk about the difference between how Muslims recall their sources and how Christians recall their sources, right? So we're going to talk about hearsay and heresy. So hadiths is what we're going to be covering today, are sayings that are attributed to Muhammad. The vast majority of hadiths are actually rejected. The accepted hadiths, the rest of them, the ones that we can read about today, are categorized into three main categories. So Sahih, that's going to be your most authentic. Hassan, which is still good, and Daif, which is weak but still accepted. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
can I mention something on that point? If we
yeah.
go into the Sharia, if we go into the Reliance of the Traveler, for instance, the Sharia manual,
Hmm.
it will tell you that Da'if Hadith are still more true. The probability of a Da'if Hadith being false is lower than its probability that it is true. And of course, the Sharia itself references Da'if Hadith, for instance. I've done this before on other shows.
Hmm.
So, especially a Da'if Hadith is not false, right? It is not false. It's just weak. Now,
Right.
understand, this doesn't mean that the Hassan, Daif, and so on, this does not refer to its chain of transmission. It refers to the content, right? And Daif Hadith that refer to Muhammad are considered true, right? So
Yep.
Daif Hadith can be true and can be considered entirely authoritative. They are not rejected by the scholars. They're not, and also this very clear. I'll bring it up later, but one scholar may accept it and another scholar may not. So there's a consensus of the scholars that these hadith are considered true.
Yep, yep. So that's kind of, yeah, exactly. So they're considered authentic, right? Otherwise they wouldn't even be recorded, right? So these are
Right.
things that the Muslims have deemed to be trustworthy. It's just how trustworthy is it?
Yeah.
And so when we start to bring up these hadith with our Muslim counterparts, right? Typically we'll bring up things like Aisha's age, beating of women, those types of things. Oddly enough, even when we bring up Sahih Hadith, they end up telling us, hey, you don't understand the science of Hadith, right? That's what they end up telling us, which has always cracked me up because science, as I have pulled up here on the screen, is defined as the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment, right? So we're talking about factual observations, right? So studying oral tradition is not a science, right? At best, it's a study of anthropology, right? The study of human behavior. or a historical like study where we're looking into these different historical questions. Um, Probably more realistically what it is it's an exercise of insanity using arbitrary weights and measures. And at the end of the day, guys, this ends up being a popularity contest, right? How many scholars, how many Muslims say it's true? Well, the more the merrier, right? The more people who say it's true, the more authentic
Yeah.
it is, right? But that has nothing to do with science. That is just an opinion.
Yeah. If I can, just
So
pause 1 second. I
yeah.
want to say thank you to Zahad. Thank you very much for the donation. Yeah, it should also be noted that you mentioned Bukhari had 7,500 authentic hadith.
Hmm.
He investigated something like 650,000 hadith
Hmm.
and only kept those for his Sahih. Now, it must be noted that these are not the only hadith that he found to be authentic. His, his Sahih is a compilation of the very best of the hadith,
Hmm.
not the only hadith, right? So,
Yep.
so don't forget, he rejected 95% plus of what he learned. And if you look at someone like Malik supposedly examined 750,000 hadith during his life. He
Hmm.
kept something like 5,000. So you're
Mm.
looking at 99% of the hadith are considered basically false. I mean,
Yep.
this is insane, and they still keep them around.
Right? Exactly. So keeping in mind, what it is, I want to be as charitable as possible when I'm speaking to Muslims, right? So if they're going to tell me I don't understand the science of hadith, well, I'm going to research what the science of hadith actually is, so that when I engage with them, I'm as knowledgeable about this topic or more knowledgeable about this topic than they are, right? So, what is the science of hadith? Well, basically, it's he said, she said, Muhammad said, right? So, according to the science of hadith, a hadith is graded upon the following four criteria. Okay. So, one, the hadith must be so well attested that it would be considered inconceivable that it could have been a lie. Two, the chain of narration must be unbroken, meaning that person A, B, C, D, down to when Bukhari writes it down, there can't be a gap in it, right? Three, everyone in the chain must be considered trustworthy. And four, this one's my favorite one, it must be free of oddness and fault. I still have no idea what that means. Um, so we're going to talk to you about two distinct things, right? Objective truth and subjective truth, right? So when we talk about the science of hadith, we have two different criteria we can look at it. Objectively true, right? Meaning it's true no matter what. If I believe it or don't believe it, it's still true. Whereas subjective tends to be true based on if I believe it or not, right? The subjectivity of a belief has nothing to do with the objective truth or facts of the situation, right? Again, keeping in mind that I'm going to be looking at this and giving as much charity to the Muslim perspective as possible, I'm going to go ahead and grant that the first three criteria are relatively objective, right? And so we'll go back here real quick. So that means that it must be so well attested that it couldn't be a lie. The chain of narration is unbroken, and everyone is considered trustworthy. Now, we can come up with 1,000 questions about those three things, like how do I determine if someone's trustworthy or not, right? Like, how could I determine that? That's super subjective. The chain of narration is unbroken. Well, it may or may not be, but how do I actually verify that if the only thing I'm relying on is oral tradition? It wouldn't be that hard for me to be telling you a story about somebody named Jill and Jack that I talked to that said that Muhammad did this. Well, Jill and Jack might not actually even have existed. And I can tell you this big long story about how great Jill and Jack are, man. They gave charity, they paid the zakat, they fasted for Ramadan. And because it's oral tradition and you don't know Jack or Jill, you just have to take my word for it. Okay. So even though I'm considering it objective, it's really basically still subjective. And then the fourth criteria, meaning free of oddness and fault, well, that's completely subjective. Who determines what is odd or faulted, right? So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at what is considered to be the most trusted hadith collection, right? The sayings of the Prophet. As most of you guys know, the most trusted hadith collection is known as Sahih Bukhari. Okay. Like Lloyd said, he collected over 600,000 hadith, right? He determined that 7,563 were Sahih, meaning strong or very strong. Of those 7,563, there was a bunch of repeats. So of the unique ones, there's really only 2,600 unique hadith.
Yeah. Can I show something on that score? Would it be okay if I just shared my screen for a minute?
Of course.
Guys, I need to introduce you to Bukhari Jesus. Okay, it's very, very important. Um, so you have Imam Bukhari Jesus of Sahih Bukhari fame. He worked miracles. You didn't know this, did you? That Imam Bukhari was a miracle worker. He worked miracles like Muhammad worked miracles. Let's listen. This is from the Fath al-Bari by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, which is translated by Abdul Hakim Murad. And it says here about Imam Bukhari, it says here that his miracles, his karamat, are numerous. So Bukhari was so holy that he actually had numerous miracles that are well attested. In other words, they are sahih. Once after helping, once
Sahih,
after helping,
Sahih.
exactly. So once after helping to build a fortress to defend the Muslim community, oh my God, he was such a philanthropist. He provided the laborers with 3 small coins worth of bread.
Mm.
But even though there were 100 laborers, there was enough bread for everyone. So he provided them, I don't know if he provided them with 3 small fishes to go with that, but yeah. So Bukhari was a miracle worker. I don't know, so yeah, there's loads and loads of miracles. Just thought you guys would love to know that. So Muslims,
Right.
if you can tell us more about the miracles, I'd love to hear more.
And
Going
then
on.
later
Yep.
he crossed his disciples crossed the Red Sea, got into a storm, and he walked past them and said, "Peace, be still," and the water calmed down too. That's what I assume happened to Bukhari here. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just ridiculous stories that people believe. Apparently, I don't know if people actually believe this, Lloyd, but the insanity of this is laughable if people didn't actually believe it. So then it actually just becomes kind of sad, right? So aside from Bukhari pretending to be Jesus, here's another little piece of information about his biography. As you can see in my little map here, there's up on the top right of the map, you see Bukhara. So that is where he was born. Okay, so he was born in Bukhara, which is 3,000 kilometers away from where Muhammad supposedly lived and taught and preached and all that stuff. Um, and he was born in the year 810 AD or 194 AH, which is after Hijrah. And Bukhari did not compose his book until 846 AD or 232 years after Hijrah. So we're talking about a man who lived 3,000 kilometers away from the life and times of his false prophet and was born hundreds of years, couple hundred, or wrote down the life and teachings of Muhammad 200, more than 200 years after all these events, right? So here's the legend of Bukhari, right? Bukhari is said to have memorized all 6,000 hadith in his mind. Now, apparently, because he can take a couple of loaves and multiply them and all kinds of stuff, he's got some sort of miraculous, amazing memory. And according to that, um, he didn't even write them down when he was memorizing them. He would just go around and talk to people and they'd tell him stories and he would memorize them. Um, and then based upon all the aforementioned criteria, I talked about those 4 different points, he compiled and finally wrote down Sahih Bukhari, right? So what do modern Muslims think about Sahih Bukhari? Well, the works of Bukhari are largely accepted as authentic sayings of Muhammad according to Sunni Islam, right, which is the largest sect of Islam. The first 3 criteria are relatively objective, right? And we will apply this Muslim standard of historical investigation to the Bible and see if the Bible fits, right? The last criteria is completely subjective, and this does actually lead to many divisions among Muslims. So going back to this oddness and fault situation, who in the world determines what is considered odd or faulted, right? So this is when we talk to the Muslims on the internet and they basically tell us like, "Oh, well, I know it's in Sahih Bukhari, but not everything in Sahih Bukhari is true." And then I think one of the reasons why they say that is because they find whatever we're showing them to be so weird and strange and wrong or faulted that they just go straight to this point number 4 and go, "It's unacceptable because it's weird." But that's subjective, right? That's not objective. And in fact, if we're talking about objective truth, so when historians actually go back and they read stories about these different major figures, historical figures, they actually use the opposite of what Muslims use. They use what's known as the criteria of embarrassment, meaning probably the more embarrassing stories about someone that are collected and are like remain in circulation, those are probably the most reliable things, right? Because if someone loves and reveres this person, why would they make up something that is strange? So, from an actual historical textual critic perspective, these odd and faulted hadith are more likely true than the ones that are super exaggerated
Yeah.
stuff, right?
Can I bring up something from
Yeah,
the
please.
Sharia? So just to let me bring this up here, guys. This is from the Umdat al-Salik, known as the Reliance of the Traveler. Okay, this is section A 4.3. Very cool. Let me double check that. A 4.2, and so I'm going to go through 3 pages. So, seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. Oddly enough, this is a weak hadith. Now, Muslims love to say that's a weak hadith, therefore we can disregard it. It's false. So, seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. That's a weak hadith. So, Muslims are obviously, by their own rules, by their own logic, required to remain ignorant and stupid. Am I wrong?
Well, they have to, otherwise they become apostates.
Exactly. But Muslims will consider that's a weak hadith. Even when you mention Sahih Bukhari, they'll say that's a weak hadith. Well, fine. Now notice this is from the Sharia. The meaning of this hadith, though the hadith itself is not well authenticated, being weak, it is true.
Hmm.
Understand? So the Sharia explicitly utilizes weak hadith in more than one occasion. Now, as for the basic obligation of Islam, you have to believe in everything brought by the messenger with absolute conviction, free of any doubt, and you are not obliged to learn any of the evidence. So, of course, the message of Muhammad is not in the Quran, it's in the Hadith and the Sirah.
Hmm.
You're required to believe. So, that's why it's called the Sunnah, the way of Muhammad. That's why they're called Sunni Muslims. They believe in the Sunnah.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to jump to the next page without getting into too much depth in terms of this. I'm going to go to page 676 now. Oh, gosh. Oh, yeah, of course. My bad. Okay, this is the one. So, now, this is another hadith. The Prophet said, a lie about me is not the same as a lie about someone else. So let me go down here. So, having discussed, now this is a discussion on hadith. Again, having discussed lies and forgeries in hadith, we must strictly distinguish them from the hadith category called not well authenticated, da'if, literally meaning weak. So termed because of such factors as having a channel of transmission containing a narrator whose memory was poor, one who was unreliable, unidentified by name, or for other reasons. Such hadiths legally differ from forgeries in the permissibility of ascribing them to the Prophet. So weak hadith can be legally, according to Islamic law, ascribed to Muhammad, and therefore they are 100% trustworthy. Okay, let me go on to the last reference that I'll make here. Any questions so far? It's haram to lie against Islam. They have at least 6 standards in I debate. Okay, he changed his opinion 4 times in one argument. Yeah, of course. Now,
But
understand,
he
Sunni.
wasn't lying though.
Well, the thing is to keep, for Muslim, lie is to keep the peace. That is not considered lying. You are telling the truth. That is considered entirely truthful. Okay? So, W48.0, weak hadiths from P9.5. A weak hadith or da'if is a term for any hadith with a chain of transmission containing a narrator whose memory was poor. Now understand, it says weak cannot be equated with false. Weak cannot be, right?
Hmm.
So understand that this just means that you have a chain of transmission. So weak refers to the chain of transmission, not to the content of the hadith itself. That is a reference to the chain of transmission. I'll pause at that.
Well,
So anyway, they mention here multiple means of transmission, okay, which can raise a hadith from well-authenticated Hassan to rigorously authenticated, or from weak to well-authenticated, okay. So there are numerous references to scholars who disagree about these things.
hmm
So for instance, weak cannot be equated with false is the fact that weak is an attribute of the hadith's chain of transmission, while false is an attribute of the hadith's text.
mm.
So when they say it's weak, you cannot refer, the weak does not refer to the content of the words, what it says, what's known as the matan, right? False is an attribute of the hadith text. These are two different things. And they do speak of contradictions between scholars where one grades it as sahih and another one grades it as weak. And there are numerous hadith with this inconsistency going on. I'll pause
Right.
there.
Sounds super objective and scientific to me and not completely subjective.
Completely.
Um, I mean, that's who knows, and that's the thing, Lloyd. And that's why I like what you do, because you just go straight to the top, right? Which goes, basically to the Sharia manuals, which lay it all out for you, right? If I'm just a lay Muslim and I know nothing about the Sharia manuals, I'm going to be looking at all of this information, reading one scholar over here that says, "Oh, this is not authentic," and then I go to another scholar over here and they say, "Oh, no, it's totally authentic," and this is how I read things. Like, it is absolutely confusing. Um, and like I said, there's no science. This is not science. This is just subjective. Like, I like this because I want to like it, so therefore I accept it, or I don't like this, so therefore I reject it. That's, to me, that's basically how you can predict whether or not a lay Muslim is going to accept or reject a particular hadith, right? So Muslims accept Sahih Bukhari based on these four different things, right? So they accept his hadith collected in 232 years after the death of Muhammad. So the sayings of Muhammad, they trust that someone living 3,000 miles or kilometers away, 230 some odd years later, can accurately collect the sayings of Muhammad. So that's their standard right here. This is what they accept. And we're going to start to apply this to the Bible here in a minute, right? So they accept oral tradition as scientific proof, right? So therefore they accept his methodology. So that it must be so well attested. We've covered this, right? That it could be inconceivable that it could be a lie. The chain of narration is unbroken, and everyone in the chain is considered trustworthy, and it's free of oddness and fault. That is what the Muslims are willing to accept. That is their standard
Yeah.
of
Now, what is
acceptance.
interesting is that they do not consider, Islam does not consider the Bible as mutawatir, which is authentic, as reliable. Now, oddly enough, the Bible has something between what, 25 and 30 something thousand copies, right?
Hmm.
From the original Hebrew through to Latin and Greek, right? So
Yep.
you've got something like 20,000 copies of the New Testament. The earliest documents date from like 25 years after the Gospel of John. Now, of course, when you look for the oldest Qurans, the oldest Quran is at least 100 years after the death of Muhammad. And of
Yep.
course, it's only a partial copy. It's like a
Hmm.
45% of the document. And
Exactly.
not only that, we do not have the original Uthmanic manuscripts. We don't have the original Ibn Mujahid manuscripts. We don't have any of the earlier manuscripts. None of them survived.
Mm.
The oldest four Qurans are all well known, like the Topkapi and the
Yep.
Samarkand and so on. And all of them are partial. Some of them are like 30, 40%, some are maybe 70%. But we do not have a complete Quran until hundreds of years after the death of Muhammad. We don't
Yep.
have any of the original manuscripts. Here we've got tens of thousands of copies of the Bible, and they're like, that stuff is not authentic. But we got James who told John, who told Sally, who told Ilham, who told Muhammad, who told Muhammad, who told Muhammad, who told Muhammad, who told Ahmad, who told Muhammad, who told Ahmad, who told his grandmother, whose then a goat came in and ate some of it, but they
Uh-huh.
and that's legit. You're like, huh?
I love how you said all of like they're by the way, everybody, they're all different Muhammads. It's just everybody names their kid Muhammad, so that's part of the chain of narration.
Yeah,
No,
Lex
you're
Van
absolutely
Man.
right, Lloyd,
Yeah,
and
sorry.
we're gonna get into the kind of the depth of the Bible and how it was brought in, keeping in mind what Muslims are willing to accept from their sources, and we're gonna apply that same standard to the Bible to see if they ought to be accepting the Bible or not, right? So we're going to ask these 4 questions, right? So is the Bible written and completed, by the way, within 232 years of Jesus, right? If the answer is yes, then that will check off one of their criteria. They should be willing to accept the Bible as true if that's true, right? Is the Bible written within 3,000 kilometers of the life and teachings of Jesus? If the answer is yes, guess what? They should be willing to accept it. Is the Bible collected from reliable oral tradition or even written tradition, right? The answer is yes, they should accept it. Is the Bible so well attested that it would be inconceivable that it could be a lie, right? So does that mean that it has an unbroken chain of narration? Is everyone in the chain considered trustworthy? And is it free of oddness or fault? I don't even know. So
Well, here's the thing. Within Islam, look, within Christianity, we've got, like I said, like 30,000 copies of the original documents, right? Roughly 30,000 copies. You can compare those documents. You can do a textual analysis. You can compare them all and see what changes may or may not have taken place. Within Islam, you have chains of narrators who claim, and people who wrote these things down hundreds of years later, who said, this guy said that, and he's
mhm.
trustworthy because he walked a little old lady across the road. Okay, fine, fine. But not only, but here's the thing: they have multiple different standards. So, for instance, within the Sharia, let me just show. I'll just take this away again.
Mhm.
There's a distinction between text and transmission. So, the content of the hadith and the chain of transmission, the isnad, and forms of evidence other than the authenticity rating of the chain of narrators. So, in other words, so chains of narration other than the authenticity rating, the Sahih, the Da'if, the Maudu, and all that, are sometimes admissible. For instance, when there's a consensus amongst the scholars who've received the hadith and they chose to believe it. So no matter what the rating of a hadith is, if the scholars say that one's good to go, it's good to go. And it says here, such a hadith is acceptable, even obligatory to believe.
Yeah, I mean, again, basically nobody has any idea about anything. There's no consistency anywhere. That's basically what I'm hearing. Um,
Yes.
that's it, right? And so is there consistency with biblical textual criticism? I don't know. We'll find out. So the Bible meets and exceeds the Muslim standards for Sahih Hadith, right? So therefore, the Bible must be Sahih, right? It's probably mutawatir, right? Since it's going to be like so well attested, there's no possible way that it could be false, right? So, question I have for any Muslims who are watching this now live or that will be watching this, or if you guys want to send this video to some of your Muslim friends, here's a question: if the Bible meets and exceeds the criteria of the Hadith, why do Muslims reject it, right? We have to apply same standards, right? So let's talk about first the dating of the New Testament, right? So the New Testament was written and completed before the death of the apostles, right? That's within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses who saw, spoke to, and learned from Jesus, right? This fact right here is far superior to the Islamic traditions, right? So again, like I said at the beginning, the written word is much more reliable than oral tradition. So not only is the Bible written down, but it was also dispersed into the Roman Empire and beyond immediately upon its writing, right? So there was never and no central authority over the written transmission of the Bible. So that therefore the text could not be centrally altered. Okay, so what that means is if the text was altered in one location over here, that doesn't mean that it was altered in this location over here, right? So that way there is a check and a balance between these different things, so that we can maintain the authentic and true original Bible as it's dispersed throughout the world, right? Like I said, it was written during the lifetime of eyewitnesses, and therefore, if it contained errors, the eyewitnesses would be able to correct those errors. So we
Right.
talk.
So the geographic dispersion obviously means that's a check and a balance against fraud because you would
Yes.
have obvious discrepancies.
Hmm.
If this happened in Syria, for argument's sake, versus Greece or widely separated geographic areas, yeah.
No, exactly. No, I mean, and speaking of geography, right? So we're talking about people who are writing these things in the location of the life and events of Jesus, relative to Sahih Bukhari, who lives 3,000 kilometers away and 200 years
Yeah.
later, right? So the
Yeah.
location, yeah. Go ahead.
Coffee
What?
Bean just did the maths on Bukhari. He apparently learned 102 hadiths by heart per day.
Of course he did, but he also, multiplied bread and fish or something like that. So he can do anything he wants. Allahu Akbar. Um, right. So the location of the author is obviously written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses to Jesus, in the same geographical area, as Jesus lived. Right. So what we're seeing here, guys, is we're seeing that the Bible is by far and away exceptionally greater than the Hadith collections that Muslims will accept, and yet they reject the authenticity of the Bible, right? So let's talk about oral and written traditions of the Bible. The Bible is compiled by authors who wrote down, in some part, oral traditions about the life of Jesus directly from eyewitnesses, right? So imagine a reporter goes out to the scene and interviews people who are eyewitnesses and writes down what these eyewitnesses say, collaborates all that information, and then puts it into his report. Well, that's basically what Luke did, right? Or they themselves were eyewitnesses of the event, right? Like the disciple Matthew was an eyewitness, and the disciple John, the one that Jesus loved, was an eyewitness. And we'll talk about a little bit more of that in detail, where kind of Mark comes into play and how he was a scribe of Peter. Um, right? And all of this is occurring within the lifetime. I'm going to repeat myself a lot here, guys, because I wanted to get through all of our heads. This happened in the location where Jesus lived during the lifetime of eyewitnesses, right? So that means that the biographies of Jesus were written down before myths and legends could start to form. Here's a little FYI Jeopardy thing, right? So back in the day, legends and myths would start to develop after 2 to 4 generations after an important person lived, right? So the mythology, and we can see this start to develop in the Gnostic Gospels, which, by the way, are 2 to 4 generations after Jesus lived. We start to see these crazy mythological types
The
of things, right? So
300s, the
the
400s,
the
and it reached the crescendo in the fourth century.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. So the Bible was written early enough to be void of the possibility of myths and legends to occurring, right? Um, so bottom line, guys, the Bible is superior to the Islamic sources, but we can keep learning more about it. Again, I
Hey,
know
can
I'm
I
repeating
inject
myself.
something about Islam at this
Yeah.
point again? Can I just drop something in? So guys, yeah, I want to bring this up. This document is called the Fat al-Bari, right? The victory of the Creator. Okay, this is the tafsir of Sahih Bukhari. Now, no scholar reads the hadith in the raw. The way we read the hadith directly, scholars do not do that. Scholars would not stoop that low. Scholars read the major researchers of the hadith. The major hadith collection is Sahih Bukhari, and the major scholar who knows Bukhari is a man called Sheikh al-Asqalani. Okay, so he wrote this thing called the Fath al-Bari. So every hadith has multiple. There's about 60, just like we have tafsir, like we have the tafsir, like Ibn Kathir
Mhm.
of the Quran. We have the tafsir of the hadith, except you've never seen one. I've never seen one. We don't have access to them. This is about the only availability we have right now, very limited. So you've got these interpretations of the hadith. And so this is the major interpretation by Sheikh al-Hajjaj. I think it's, Hajar al-Asqalani. So let's have a look at this, right? So removing weak hadith from the works, okay, was not the example of the scholars. Scholars did not remove weak hadith from their hadith collections, okay? Otherwise, Imam Ibn Hajar would not have included them himself in the Fath al-Bari as sources to take knowledge from.
Mm.
So the absolute best top Islamic scholars and the best experts on the hadith, they have a name for it. I think they're the muhadith, I think they're called. They used the weak hadith as sources of knowledge. Weak hadith are used to support opinions because a weak hadith containing the words of the Prophet is preferred over pure opinion and personal judgment or reasoning. That's what the meaning of ijtihad is.
Mm.
And this is the example set by all the scholars, including Imam Bukhari himself, who used weak hadith deliberately in his work Al-Adab al-Mufrad. The Sahih of Imam Bukhari is a collection of the Sahih hadith specifically, not a collection of the only hadith that scholars should use.
Mm.
A Sahih hadith has about a 99 to 100% chance of being entirely accurate. A Hasan hadith has about an 85 to 99% chance of being entirely accurate. A Da'if hadith has a 45 to 85% chance of being entirely accurate. And this is the widest band of accuracy. Even a fabricated hadith, a Maudu hadith, has a 0 to 45% chance of being accurate, since the grading it was given may have been wrong, or the fabricator may have spoken the truth in this instance. Weak hadith should not be treated like fabricated hadith because an 85% chance of being entirely accurate is a very high chance. Just wanted to let you know, this is an opinion written by scholars at two universities, one Medina and the other Al-Azhar. So these are from the two major seminaries in the Sunni Islamic world. This is the opinion of the scholars from the two major seminaries who collaborated on this work. There is no higher opinion on this. Sorry, there is a higher opinion on this. People like Yahya and the complete idiots with no qualifications in the YouTube comments. My bad, I forgot. Those are the top experts of Islam. Excuse my.
Yeah,
How could I
keyboard
forget?
jihadis always have the highest amount of respectability for sure.
Yeah, they're the top scholars of Islam. So yeah, sorry, I don't know how I could have forgotten that. So yeah. So anyway, yeah, I just
That's
wanted to pass that on. So
no,
you
that's
guys have an
incredibly
opinion as well.
interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That's a little bit of news to me. So the Bible is so well attested, right? Written down during the lifetime of eyewitnesses, written by eyewitnesses or as a result of eyewitness testimony, multiply attested by 8 biblical authors, right? The key events of Jesus' life are attested by historians, by the way, historians who don't like Christians, um, such as Tacitus, who is a Roman historian, and Josephus, who is a Jewish historian. Also in existence today are several other writings from people within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses that are found outside of the Bible that attest to the main facts about Jesus' life, particularly his death by crucifixion on the cross, right? So, what do we have as Christians? We have the unbroken chain of authorship. Okay. I'm not saying narration, I'm saying authorship because the palest ink is always more accurate than the sharpest memory, right? So, let's talk about some of the authors, right? John, who is the author of the Gospel of John and a bunch of other books, claims in his gospel to be an eyewitness and the disciple that Jesus loved, right? Here's what's interesting about John. John is known personally by all of the other biblical authors, such as Luke, who is the author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts, and a traveling companion of Paul. Peter, who is the author of 1st and 2nd Peter. John Mark, who is the author of the Gospel of Mark and a scribe of Peter. Matthew, who is the author of the Gospel of Matthew and disciple of Jesus. James, the author of the Epistle of James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, and in some traditions, Jesus' half-brother. Paul, the author of 13 to 14, and the reason why I say 13 to 14 is because we're not quite sure who wrote Hebrews, New Testament books. John knew all of these people. John claims in his gospel to be an eyewitness. All of these people collaborated, knew each other, and could peer review one another, right? So if all the authors know each other personally, they could peer review the writings, even if the authors discipled nobody else, right? So we're talking about chain of authorship. Even if the only thing we had was the writings of these authors and they didn't teach anybody else anything, it would still be a valid historical writing. Okay.
I just want to
However,
pause it for a moment.
say what?
Just sorry, two things. Thank you very much for the donation, much appreciated. And two, yeah, we have the crosstalk. Shamun Khakan is in the chat. Thank you for stopping by. Really appreciate it. And hey, I want you and AT to get together at some point and do a show. I think you guys would do something really interesting. So yeah, I have I did pass on the information. So guys, I hope you guys will get together and chat soon and do a show, and then I can come and lurk in your comment stream. Okay.
Oh, there you go. You can spam us and annoy us or something like that.
I will.
No,
I'll be Mr. Muslim. I'll be asking questions.
no, I really look forward to it. I apologize for not reaching out to you yet, brother. I just had a baby a couple weeks ago, so I've been kind of whatever. And then Lloyd and I always have our standing time, but we should definitely make some time to get together. I would love to interview you. I would just want to get to know you, get to know your story. So look for that here in the upcoming year or two, however long it takes for me to get my life back in order. Um, right. So like I was saying, was even if the authors did not disciple anyone, all their writings would still be in existence and they would still be valid historical testimony, right? However, we can do one better. The authors did disciple other people, right? And those other people also started writing things about the life and times of and teaching of Jesus, right?
Did
And
any
then
of that
those
stuff get eaten
disciples
by a
had
goat?
disciples and discipled others, and so on. So we literally have an unbroken written chain of authorship from the apostles of Jesus through today. And not just one little
A
chain,
more
it's chain, 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 chain.
a more important question: do we have an uneaten chain of transmission? I mean, I really, I mean, was any of this stuff claimed to have been eaten by a goat?
Mm.
Maybe eaten by, I don't know, goldfish? Just please let me know. Was there any record of that in the Gospels? Were any of the Gospels eaten by a goldfish, eaten
Mm.
by a sheep, eaten by a goat, anything like that? Nothing, nothing. So we have an uneaten chain of
We
transmission. Okay,
have an
which is that's
uneaten chain, and that is the most
it's a step
important
up.
fact of today. You know what? You know what's funny, Lloyd, is like we go into all this incredibly great information, and people are going to remember it for 10 minutes, but they will never forget that we have an uneaten chain of transmission of the Bible.
Veronica says, yeah, well, at least the Islamic story, the Islamic narrative is well digested, which it's also been pooped out, I guess, if that's how you want to think about it, take it to its logical conclusion. It could be under someone's shoe, and that we just let's get our minds out of the gutter. So basically, what was any of the gospel stuff written on rocks,
Mm,
pieces of bone, and leaves,
I
the
don't know.
way
I don't
because
know.
I don't think that was the situation with the New Testament Gospels. I mean, because don't forget the Gospels, even the Quran wasn't written at the time of Muhammad's death.
Right,
It was not compiled, and it
right.
was written in all of these sources. They had to collect all these sources. And was it any time was the Bible burned and rewritten?
Never burned and rewritten. There was some enemies, especially Rome, who burned quite a bit of it, but luckily it was dispersed
But
throughout
it
the
wasn't
entire world by
deliberately
then.
collected and gathered together by one of the major fathers of the church, burned and then rewritten for
Yeah, nobody
convenience,
in the
correct?
church ever had the desire to hide any of the evidence of the Bible. Um, yeah, we could totally do a show on how the Quran came to be and how there are holes, lots of holes in the narrative. But yeah, that's anyway.
Would those be like tooth marks, like holes left by tooth marks, or
Mostly by the goat. But yeah, who knows? Who knows? You know, the battle of was the battle of Yamama. Yeah, that's a whole issue. Um,
okay?
anyway, back to the topic. Reliability of the biblical authors, the witnesses, right? So, by the nature of the multiple attestations of more than 8 biblical authors, the uniformed message and their witness and their testimony, the confirmation of their testimony by both friendly and enemy writers, the datings of their writings, which were completed and compiled before the death of the eyewitnesses, and the location of where their writings came from, which is within the location of the life and teachings of Jesus. By the nature of all that information, we can confirm that their writings are reliable and trustworthy, right? So let's review really quickly. What do Muslims have? Well, it's more like what don't Muslims have? They have no extant writings from eyewitnesses. Muslims have no extant writings from people who knew eyewitnesses. Muslims have no extant writings from people who knew people who knew people who were eyewitnesses. Muslims have no written and reliable testament until Muhammad al-Bukhari, who came over 200 years later and compiled his hadith collection, right? If that is their standard, then the New Testament by far and away exceeds their criteria, right? Again, reviewing Christians, we have first century authorship, writing, attestation, eyewitnesses, and peer review. We have everything that you could possibly ask for when it comes to the historicity of the accuracy of the teachings and life of Jesus, right? So this is kind of
Which
what
I
we're going to.
think is probably why Muslims had to pretend that hearsay is a form of science, that they have these rigorously authentic chains of narration, these mutawatir hadith narrations, because they actually have no textual proof. They've only got hearsay. This guy told this guy, told that guy, told this guy, and this guy had a good heart and he loved his grandma very much, and
Yeah.
therefore he was reliable.
Mm-hmm.
This is quite literally, they have no actual physical evidence. They've got no proof. They have no early Qurans. And therefore, they disparage the written texts and they state that their hearsay is actually far more reliable.
Well, it's scientific. It's science. I don't even know.
Sure, I mean,
Um,
for given low values of science, I'm sure, yeah.
right. So this is a great question that I get a lot from non-Christians and Christians alike, right? So a lot of Christians don't realize how their manuscript, how our manuscript came to be, how our New Testament came to be, how reliable it is, right? So if we're uneducated to this, sometimes it can be a little bit of a daunting question to answer, right? When we get accused of our text being corrupted and blah 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 blah. Well, you won't question it once you realize the actual facts of the situation, right? So I mentioned some of these facts already, right? So the text grew and it was never centrally controlled, right? It quickly spread throughout the entire Roman world and beyond. We have in existence today over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, right? We have tens of thousands of total early manuscripts written in Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Latin, and Armenian. Okay.
Can I throw
So
something
we
in
have
there?
a plethora of information. Yeah, go ahead, brother.
So, in terms of the way that science examines, in terms of the way science works with texts, right, to establish the authenticity of a text, they will look at the number of copies. Now, the second most authentic document in history is Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad has 630 or 625 copies in existence that have been
Mhm.
discovered. And these copies corroborate each other, and these copies therefore verify that this is an authentic transmission of the document. For the
Yeah.
Bible, we've got something like 32,000. Now, just for the Greek versions of the New Testament, we've got 5,852 known copies, right?
Yep.
5,852. Now, if you consider we also have 10,000 Latin copies, then we have 10,000 Syriac and Aramaic copies. So you
Yep.
have, just for the New Testament, you've got 26,000 copies. This is significantly more than the 620, 630 that are used to establish the authenticity of the Iliad, right?
Hmm.
Which is the second most authentic document. No one disputes the authenticity of the Iliad, right? So
Right.
the Bible has dozens of times more authenticity. For the Quran, we've got like, we're collecting Easter eggs right here in February, man. So yeah,
Uh,
moving on.
Easter came early this year.
Yeah.
And kind of as you were talking, another way that you can verify the accuracy or the historicity of a document such as the Bible is you can actually verify this through archaeology, right? Through geography. So when you read through the Gospels, when you read through the epistles and stuff like that, you get these little like, oh, they went here. There was this, particular thing of geography. Here was this political figure. And if that document was written at that time, then the geography and the political figures and stuff like that of that day are going to be accurate, right? Which the Bible is. The Bible is archaeology, the geography, and the main political figures of the time are 100% accurate to what it is that we know about it, right? So that's another way to verify the accuracy of any document, but as we're talking about it, the New Testament, right? So how many documents do we have? We've been talking about this, right? So we have 2.6 million, right? I'm gonna do my Dr. Evil thing, million pages of Greek manuscripts. The average size manuscript is 450 pages, and most of these manuscripts that we have in existence today, because they were written on papyri, which are that falls apart really quickly. Most of them are from the years 100 to 300 AD. So let's learn a little bit more about the gospel authors, right? So Matthew, I mentioned this earlier, is disciple of Jesus, tax collector, and he wrote his gospel, most people believe, for a Jewish audience. Mark, who is the scribe of Peter, he wrote his gospel, most believe, for a Roman audience. Luke, who is a physician, a historian, and a traveling companion of Paul, well, he says at the beginning of his gospel, he wrote it for a friend. And John, the disciple of Jesus loved, he wrote a historical gospel, but he focused more on the spiritual truths of what it is that Jesus was teaching. So this is where we get into some controversial stuff, right? So the dating of the Gospels, a lot of people are going to have us believe that the Gospels were written 70 AD or even later than that. I'm going to make my argument for that they were written much, much earlier than most people believe. And here is why and not just there's a lot of other Christians who believe this as well. So we all know that Luke wrote Acts and the Gospel of Luke, right? Acts does not include, right? Remember, Luke was the traveling companion of Paul. He does not include the martyrdom of Paul, okay, which happened around 64 AD. So Paul was killed during the reign of Nero, sometime after the Great Fire of Rome, okay? So Luke does not mention the fire nor the persecution of Christians as a result. By using inductive reasoning, right, we can with a high degree of likelihood say that Acts was written before all of these events took place, right? Because if he didn't, if he wrote it afterwards, we would assume that he would have included those major events, right? So if we understand that Acts must have been written sometime before 64 AD, no later than 64 AD, then we know that Acts is a sequel following the Gospel of Luke. That means that Luke must have been written sometime before that. Most historians believe that Luke was written after Matthew and that Matthew was written after Mark, right? By simple deductive reasoning, right, we can assume that Matthew was written in the early to late 50s, Mark was written in the late 40s to early 50s. Those are the synoptic gospels. But what about John? Okay. Well, John makes no mention of the destruction of the temple nor the fire of Rome or anything like that in his thing. So by using inductive reasoning, once again, we can assume that John's writings came before the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD. What about the epistles? Well, Paul wrote 13 to 14 letters. Remember, we talked about Hebrews. We're not sure if he wrote that or not. And historians all agree that they were written down between 50 AD and 64 AD, right? John wrote 3 letters and the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, before his death, sometime between 95 and 100 AD. James wrote 1 epistle dated from around as early 40 AD. Peter wrote 2 epistles before his death in the mid 60s, and Jude wrote 1 epistle, which we're not exactly sure when it was written, sometime between 70 and 90 AD. Okay, again, this alone should be valid proof that the Bible is accurate, right? But we can go one further. Like I said, the chain of narration begins with multiply attested first century witnesses. It continues with apostolic church fathers, and it spread to the early church fathers, right?
Yeah.
So the lives of not the narrators, but of the authors. We're going to get into that in here in a second. Did
Yeah.
you say
I just
something,
want to ask
Lloyd?
you, how many slides do we still have left? Just
I
curious.
am all literally almost done. I was
Okay.
thinking about that. We're
Yeah.
almost coming
I
up
was
on
thinking of
time.
throwing in something on hadith again. Should I just pepper just to pepper the conversation with some information about hadith? Should I go back to mention something about that?
How about this will take me 2 minutes if I just bust through this, and then how about the end we
Okay,
do that?
no
Does that
worries.
sound
Yeah.
okay?
Excellent. Yeah.
All right,
This
cool,
is
brother.
interesting information. This is really
Yeah.
interesting.
So the lives of the authors, right? So I'm just gonna go ahead and put this up on the screen here so you guys can take a look at it. You might have to zoom in if you're on your phone or something like that. But here are the church fathers' timelines, right? You see on the left hand of your screen the birth of Jesus, his crucifixion, the life of early apostolic church fathers like Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp. Think about the life of John, Peter, Paul, James, all those people. They overlap one another, right? So as you can see here, these little boxes go across your screen and they show you that this is unbroken, and all of these people have writings that we can read today, right? So there is an unbroken chain of authorship.
So how
And
do we
again, here's
verify that these people that are claimed to have transmitted the hadith orally, how do we know they even existed?
you just have to take the person's word for it because the person in front of them was trustworthy.
I mean, so how do you know these scholars didn't just make it up? I mean, we have no physical proof that these people existed.
Right,
And don't
exactly. And that's the
forget, when
question. You
Bukhari was
can't.
collecting his hadith, this is 200 years after the fact. So
Mm-hmm.
now you've got to go, and someone's going to say, yeah, there was, yeah, 50 years ago, there was Ahmad who spoke to a guy 53 years ago called I don't know, you pick a name, Muhammad, who spoke to a guy called Muhammad 3 years before
Mm-hmm.
that, who spoke to a dude called Muhammad, who spoke to
Mm-hmm.
someone called Muhammad, who spoke to someone called Ahmad, so I'm not very creative, I guess, with the names, but understand
Neither are they. Don't worry.
200 years after the fact, someone's going and says, well, we've got a list here of 40 names of people that we, for a fact, spoke to each other and transmitted this accurately. Have you played Broken Telephone? After 5 minutes, you have gibberish, you have garbage.
Yep.
Not even 5 minutes, man. You play Broken Telephone with 10 people, and whatever you said in the beginning, that's not what comes out at the end. You know, 5 minutes. And imagine 200 years later, someone comes along and says, do you remember when we had a conversation about, when this happened? Like, no, you don't. Like, sorry,
Mm-hmm.
go on, please. Yeah, but I mean,
No.
nonsense. Yeah.
Oh, it's a great point though. It's insanity. Like I said, at best, this is an exercise of insanity using unequal weights and measures. Here is just another graph showing you the names, and you can go and look up Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria. You can look up all these people, Tertullian, whoever it is, and you can go and find their writings literally today. Um, and so we don't only have this like, oh, these people existed type of situation because somebody in front of me said it. We literally have their paper and pen and writings and copies of their stuff that have been dispersed throughout the entire world, throughout the entire Roman world at first and throughout the rest of the world now.
Uh,
There is no
it's, just pause a
doubt.
second. Erican's
Yeah.
asking, what's the gap between Origin of Alexandria and Eusebius? Because there seems to be a small gap.
There is a little bit. Let me go back to the last slide. I think we might be able to see that if I can get my computer working
And you have
right.
Cyprian as well. So there's Cyprian, Origin, and
Yep. So right
Eusebius.
here, Origin 254, Eusebius was at 260, right? So we've got a little bit of a gap there. But when we move forward, what we were looking at there was the Greek fathers. When we move forward, what we see is the Latin fathers. So like Cyprian of Carthage is going to be overlapping, it looks like, from there. So that's a good question. But having said that, right, the conclusion, for Muslims, the Bible exceeds the Muslim requirements for authenticity by far and away. So if a Muslim's willing to accept Sahih Bukhari as authentic, they should accept the Bible as mutawatir. It is by
Yeah.
far and away much more authentic than the things that they are willing to
But
accept.
but this is why there's been no academic research of the Quran the way there has been for the Bible for 200 years.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, the textual criticism of the Bible started very heavily in the 1800s. The textual criticism of the
I would
Islamic
call it more like a
sources are
textual
just
assault
now
on the
beginning.
Bible.
Say what? Sorry.
I would in many ways characterized as a textual assault. It was an attempt to
Oh,
undermine the Bible.
absolutely, right? And the cream rises to the top, right? If the I appreciate it. If the Bible is true and you assault, and it still stands, man, I trust it that much more. Real
Right.
quick, back to Erican. That is a good question that you were asking. Kind of with the gap here. The only thing that I would say is all these people's writings, right? Irenaeus, Origen, Tertullian, Polycarp, Ignatius, Clement, all of these people's writings, all of the Gospels and such like that were already in existence. So even if there is a few year gap between him and Eusebius, there's no gap in writings from it. So that'd be my only thing that I just thought of to add to
And of
that.
course, if these people knew people, some of those people would still be alive and you could still interview the eyewitnesses.
Hmm.
So a
Yep,
6 year gap is very minor, and they would have had friends and people they trained and mentored and students and others who knew them, so they would be able to report upon that. So I think that's still viable.
I agree.
Whereas for me to go
I
and
agree.
see, okay, well, what did this dude say 300 years ago, 200 years ago? It's like, okay, I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah. So hold on. I was going to say something. Yeah, guys, I just want to, uh, Sharia law, I just want to mention something about this. Again, back to hadith, since you were talking about the authenticity. I want to mention when a person who has related a hadith is an Islamic scholar of the first rank, okay, and this is a warning coming from the Islamic law. It is not enough for a student or popular writer or a YouTube commentator to find one chain of transmission for the hadith that is weak and then try to undermine that hadith. He doesn't decide the authenticity of hadith. That's done by the scholars, right? There are a great many hadith with several chains of transmission and adequate scholarly treatment of how these affect the hadith's authenticity has been traditionally held to require a master of hadith, known as a hafiz. Those like Bukhari, Muslim, Dahabi, Ibn Kathir, or Suyuti, who have memorized at least 100,000 hadiths, their texts, the chains of transmission, and significance to undertake the comparative study of the hadith's various chains of transmission that cannot be accurately assessed without such knowledge. Now, of course, we know that the YouTube commenters know diddly, as you well know. They are absolutely unqualified to make any such assessment. They are simply just saying random things and hoping for the best. So today, when not one hadith master or hafiz remains in the Muslim community, we do not accept the judgment of any would-be reclassifiers of hadith, no matter how large their popular following, unless it is corroborated by the work of previous hadith masters. And it's called muhaddithin. Those are the scholars of the hadith. And just a final point here, hadith are a pitfall. This is Sheikh Abdal Hakim Murad. This is the guy that I mentioned earlier who told us about the wonders of the Bukhari Jesus, who told us about the miracles of Bukhari Jesus. He happens to be the dean of Cambridge Islamic College in the UK, which trains imams for British mosques. He was voted Britain's most influential Muslim thinker by Jordan's Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Centre in 2010, and he has translated a number of books from the Arabic, including sections of Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulum al-Din, which is the second most popular Islamic spiritual work after the Quran itself. This is the second most popular book read in the Islamic world after the Quran. And he says, there are few hadiths which can be understood adequately without reference to the often complex debates which have taken place concerning them between scholars. And he goes on to say, Sufyan ibn Unayna, or Yahya, the great early hadith scholar, used to remark, blah, 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 blah. The hadith are a pitfall except for the scholars. So, in other words, only the scholars can understand the hadith. For this reason, no Muslim scholar of repute uses a hadith before checking the commentaries to ascertain its precise meaning, context, and application.
Mm,
Just thought I would throw that in there.
yeah.
So yeah, thanks. I hope, guys, that was useful. So, Harasade asks, is there any way we can acquire the slides shown 5 minutes ago?
Yeah,
You,
I was asking him if he was talking about yours or mine. I'd be more than happy. Do I just share that with you, Lloyd, or and then you
I,
could post it in there?
I don't know. I normally just link my stuff in the description because I link it online using, are you using PowerPoint or using something from the,
Yeah, it's PowerPoint. I could turn it into
because
like a PDF or something.
You can do that probably, yeah, because there's no animations. Yeah, I typically just link the PowerPoint online. I make an online copy and share the link, but yeah, make a PDF and
Okay. Yeah,
we
or
can
if
just put it in the
anybody ever wants
description.
to, yeah, and
Yeah,
if anybody ever wants to contact me or get something specifically like that, just asktruthapologetics@gmail.com. So
right.
just shoot me a message. I'll be more than happy to share anything with you.
Yeah, and then of course we have who can memorize 100,000 hadiths? That's Veronica at the well. Well, the thing is, if you read like for instance, there's a story about Malik, right? One of the four founders, one of the four Mujtahid Mutlaq, right? They're called because these Mujtahid Mutlaq is the infallible scholar of Islam. So that's one of the founders of the four schools of jurisprudence. In other words, these are scholars who are basically perfect in their understanding, right? Error-free scholars. And he basically says a scholar needs to know at least 300,000, if not more. I think it could be 500,000, but if I remember the story, but you need to know at least 300,000 hadith to be a muhaddithin. So, Adam Leuchter, there's an interesting study of the oral tradition among Yugoslav Muslims in the 30s. It says a lot about the oral tradition, maybe. So, okay, yeah. Oh, the
Hmm.
one showing the Bible dates. That was the Bible dates. So it's from Harasadia AT. Yeah.
Say what?
The Bible dates. The one showing the dates of the Bible. The
Oh
authenticity of the
yeah,
Bible, I think. Yeah.
yeah. I'll just share the whole thing. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
so Josie
and
Wales says, when we can show the city of David and
yeah.
say with some certainty, this is the house of St. Peter on the Sea of Galilee, but they are concreting over Aisha's house in Mecca, something is very wrong. Yes, there has been no archaeology there. They've literally dug up the whole place and just built hotels and built
Hmm.
stuff. They've completely ruined it. Yeah, because there's nothing to be found there. It's yeah.
Yes, I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, that's more than likely true. I was actually getting ready to have you read Josie Wales' thing. I'm glad you did.
Yeah. Yeah, so guys, that's it. Oh yeah, I'm busy sharing my screen here. This is
Dang,
yeah, my screen saver.
is that you
Sorry,
when you were like in the military, man?
yeah, that was me when I was back in Iraq, man, doing my thing. No, my
Pretty awesome.
screensaver, no, my screensaver, my desktop background changes every 60 seconds. Um, yeah, so that's from Crisis. That's yeah, finished that many years ago, but I always enjoyed the game.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you know what I was gonna say about like memorizing hadith? Like I have probably, and Lloyd, you might be the same. I've probably memorized over 100,000 movie quotes, like from comedy movies from the 90s and early 2000s. So it can't be that hard to memorize that many hadith. That's all I'm gonna say.
yeah, but you see, you memorized original movie quotes. So when you've got 100,000 hadith and 90,000 of them are actually just copies of each other,
Mm,
you, you know, in
yeah,
fact, they're just copies of the other 10,000. They're just rewrites of the same few thousand. So yeah, you can do a few thousand of them.
right, exactly.
You know, like watch me do this. I can memorize. I've memorized thousands of quotes in movies too. I'll be back. See, I memorized that. That was easy. That
It's
was
not a tumor. Go
okay, guys.
run to the chopper.
Yeah, get to the chopper. Yeah,
I think we've memorized all the Arnold quotes. Let's just be honest about that.
I think so. I mean, yeah, thousands of lines. Yeah, exactly. There you go. You know, I mean, I was, you know, so yeah. Before we start making dumb jokes again, you know, the apologetics and comedy hour.
Hmm.
So, so guys, yeah, that's it from me. I hope that was helpful and useful to you, that you've learned a lot about the authenticity of the Bible in terms of its textual preservation, the history, some of the early scholars, and yeah. So yeah, thanks, AT. Much appreciated. That was a really, really good presentation. Looked better than mine. I'm very jealous.
Well, there's a
Lovely.
little button on the side. I'm going to teach you about how PowerPoint works. There's a little button that says like make your slide fancy. I can't remember exactly what it is.
Design,
And
the
then it
design
like
button.
yeah, it's great. You
The
just
difference
add
is he
you
was
just click
educated
and
at an
drag
American.
pictures.
You see, the American education versus me. I came from Africa. The best we could do was what they called a school for emotionally disturbed teachers. This is the
I had
result.
a few of those, but probably not too many.
Yeah, guys. So anyway, thanks, guys. I hope that was interesting. Tomorrow evening, I will be on with Shamun Khan. I need to set that up, that stream live. I'll set up that stream now before I get to bed here tonight. So that he and I will be discussing a debate between a couple of scholars,
Hmm?
between a well-known Islamic apologist and Hatun Tash and another. So yeah,
Oh,
just
right.
look
Yeah.
out for that. I'll put that up tonight, and we'll be discussing that and going through some of that. And Shamoon has also had some fascinating feedback from people. regarding the last show that we did. People said I was an idiot, and they couldn't explain why. They said I was wrong. They couldn't show any proof,
Mm.
and then he invited them to come live on air with us and explain to us using the sources how exactly I misquoted, and they refused. So, yeah. AT, sorry, we didn't get to the things that you wanted to do. You wanted to answer some
Oh no,
questions. Were we
it's
able
good.
to do that?
Yeah, we'll
Okay.
we'll we'll cover it later. Just in case everybody's wondering, there's been a ex-Muslim who Lloyd actually had a big hand in getting him off of Islam, and I think he's seeking for some guidance and wondering whether or not Christianity is for him. So he's been asking a lot of really good questions, really tough questions, right? And so I did prepare a little bit of an answer for him because he actually asked me the same question that Ahmed Dot has been asking regarding can God be seen or blah blah blah. Which I prepared something for, but we'll be able to cover that,
Yeah.
Lloyd, next week.
Yeah,
So sometimes it's
he
nice to leave them on a
yeah, after
cliffhanger.
about 2 weeks of back and forth, and I was just throwing the Sharia at this guy, and in his own sources, he turned around one day, and some of you guys were there. You were part of it, and he said, "I can't defend Islam anymore. I can't do this anymore." And
Yep,
he's been talking to AT, and yeah, we're praying for the best. So that
absolutely.
was yeah, that's quite humbling when that happens. It's happened a couple of times. I gave the guy a really hard time, but he was one of those who was doing the whole F Jesus thing and F you're this, and you know, he was pretty nasty. But yeah, what can I say? Uh, you know, things changed.
Exactly. It's
So
awesome.
so yeah, cool man. Hey guys, I gotta call it. Yeah, it's back to the salt mines tomorrow. You know,
Better than the coal mines, I suppose. But yeah, it's all good.
you're right. You're right. Better than the coal mines. Yeah, but yeah. So yeah, guys, if anybody wants some salt, let me know. I'll try and mine some tomorrow. Look, guys, thank you very much for the great questions. I do appreciate the donations, and thank you for the very active, interactive chat. I hope this has been educational and helpful, and that the jokes have been funny. I know previously it was given old joke a home week, so we were donating old jokes. This time, I think we had a few fresh ones, and yeah, guys. So thank you very much. Any last words, At? I'll let you finish off.
No, just God bless you, everybody. Have yourself a wonderful, wonderful week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night. Have a great week. Have a great weekend. Oh, by the way, my dad is well. I want to say thank you guys very much. It's been hard getting hold of him. It's been really tough to speak to him. He's back at work. He is going to be doing a lengthy series of tests. They caught it very early because we had no
Mm,
information. We had no information. Everyone was in a huge panic. They caught it early, so now he's going to be doing an extensive series of tests over the next week. We'll only know more on Friday, but so far so good. He's sounding very
wow,
positive. He's back,
that's
So
awesome,
yeah,
man.
that's man, that's a big change. Yeah, that's a big change
That's so
because we
cool.
had no idea what was going on. We just knew there was a massive sudden panic. So yeah, so what can I say? Thank you guys. Appreciate the support. It's been really good. So yeah, please keep up the prayers, and I will inform everyone in the next week or so once we get news. We won't know anything before Friday or after. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Take care.
See you guys.
See you. Bye.